Welcome, everybody, to the second annual Anne Snitow Prize ceremony. Thank you all for coming, and thanks, of course, to our honored guests tonight. Very near the end of Anne's life, when Anne was in her hospital bed in Danny's studio with the doors closed, everybody else was outside, lots of people in the loft, sitting at the table, napping in the living room, reading, eating, making martinis. It was the usual scene. The door opened and Anne was wheeled out by her caregiver on the little secretary chair that was serving as a wheelchair. She wheeled up to the table where everyone was looking at her and she said, "I'm coming out to sit Shiva with you." For Anne Snitow, there was no situation, including her own demise, that was too grim for a party. In good times and bad times, we gathered at the loft at Danny and Anne's to discuss, to catch up, to make plans, to make posters, to laugh, and of course, to eat. There was never a shortage of food or paper plates or plastic wine glasses or, of course, tablecloths. There were dozens of tablecloths. I don't know about you, but boy, I could use some of that now. I don't mean the hummus and the bagel chips. I mean the talk, the community, and Anne. 2 years and 4 months since Anne's death, things have gotten grimmer and grimmer, and there seems to be no end of it. It is hard to feel like partying, even if we were allowed to party. In one way, I'm glad that Anne is not here to have to witness the end of the right to abortion, the right to vote, so many things that we fought so hard for. And yet I long for her because when you were with her, you always came away with the feeling that no matter how bad things get, you can always do something about it. At the very least, you can think it through, you can rethink it, you can try to understand it, you can bear witness, and you can build the community, the movements, the friendships that are so crucial to living through hard times. These are the qualities that we celebrate with the Anne Snitow Prize and that we celebrate tonight for our winner, Sarah Schulman. Rigor, flexibility, and originality of thought, tolerance of contradiction, embrace of ambiguity, generosity, perseverance, effectiveness, and a love of pleasure, a commitment to the politics of pleasure. Because what you got from Anne was the contact high of the pleasures that she took in so many things: Shakespeare, salad, dishware, baseball, Danny's music, her friends' projects, all of her friends' projects, and of course, feminism. Even at its most vexing, feminism was for her a constantly renewable source of energy, fascination, and joy. So let's raise whatever glasses you happen to have around and toast to Anne, to Sarah, and to joy. And also to that other pleasure-loving, generous, generative, sui generis feminist, a feminist who brought, like Anne did, so many people to feminism and to whose words we turn again and again. That, of course, is Bell Hooks, who died today at the very young age of 69. I want to first thank our brilliant and hardworking organizing committee, all of whom are very, very busy with many, many commitments. Laura Liu and Miriam Tickton, who are the co-chairs of our nominating committee, who worked with the great august NomCom to get the word out, to get the nominations in, to keep going out and getting more people, to make sure that all of those connections and our big web got bigger and bigger. To Katie Detweiler, who joined the organizing committee and within about 5 seconds was the chair of the selection committee. She, along with our able administrative assistant, Nicole Ann Lobo, wrangled the jury together, helped them at every stage, organized all of the files and the nominees, made sure that everybody got there on time, held everybody's hand, and made that process as easy and as pleasant as it could be. Tash Lewis, who, along with being the co-editor in chief of Dissent magazine, was our liaison to Dissent magazine, our treasurer, who did everything quietly and competently, So nobody really knew she was doing it, but it all got done. And of course, Dana Tortorici, who knows how to do everything and who did everything with one hand tied behind her back while organizing an enormous wedding in the middle of a pandemic. I want to thank our administrative assistant, Nicole Ann, and our designer and tech person, Lisa Borst, our distinguished nominating committee, and this year's jury, who worked conscientiously, seriously, thoughtfully, cheerfully, and with great goodwill and respect toward one another and toward the nominees. From the whole organizing committee, we thank you. And of course, gratitude to our many donors, generous donors without whom, of course, none of this would happen. I'm going to turn the dais over to Premila Nadasen, professor of history at Barnard College, who was last year's winner, the inaugural winner of the Ann Snitow Prize, who also served, along with 5 others, on the jury that selected Sarah. So I'm going to let her introduce her fellow judges and pass the torch to the 2021 winner of the Ann Snitow Prize, Sarah Schulman. Thank you, Premila.
Thank you so much, Judith. I want to welcome everybody here tonight, and I'm very happy to join you this evening in the presentation of this award. And I want to begin with a few thank yous as well, in addition to everyone that Judith has thanked. I want to thank Judith, who is a key organizer, a convener, who has made so much of what is happening tonight possible. So thank you, Judith, for all your hard work. And for the communications and everything you've done all through this process, as well as the organizing committee, Lisa and Nicole Ann, who are doing a lot of the behind the scenes work. And I want to name the prize committee members, many of whom are here tonight: Barbara Ransby, Karma Chavez, Liat Ben Moshe, Kavya Asoka, and Sarah Leonard. And I want to thank the prize committee for their diligent work and thoughtful consideration. There were a very large number of excellent nominations. And one of the things about a prize such as this is you really get a window into some of the really inspiring work that's taking place. I also want to take a moment to pay my respects to Bell Hooks, a giant in the field of feminist theory and activism, and someone who had an enormous influence on me and my thinking as an undergraduate. So it does seem appropriate to gather and pay tribute to ongoing feminist contributions this evening. And I want to begin by saying what an honor it is to be presenting this award. I don't know Sarah very well. I only met Sarah once, but I've been following her work for a very long time, and I know that she's more than worthy of this award. I was asked to talk a little bit about what I've done over the past year, and I want to do that in the context of thinking about the importance of Sarah's work. When I was awarded the prize a year ago, we were in the midst of one of many waves of the pandemic. And here we are a year later, experiencing another wave, in addition to a whole number of other assaults. Last year, I was about to teach a course called Pandemic Tales in collaboration with a grassroots group in New York City that's called the Damayan Migrant Workers Association. And Damayan is a worker-led Filipino organization that provides support for and organizes Filipino workers. The organization asked me and my students to produce a report about the impact of the pandemic on the Filipino community. Students conducted oral histories with members, most of whom are labor trafficking survivors. And using that information, we wrote a 45-page report, which we called Pandemic Tales, Uplifting the Voices and Organizing of Filipino Migrant Workers. And that subtitle is important. We listen to and we learn from organizers and labor trafficking survivors. And I think this was especially important because academic knowledge is so often shaped by power, by theorists who are ensconced in the ivory tower. So our goal was to decenter academic expertise and trouble traditional forms of knowledge production, to ask what we could learn about the pandemic from some of the most marginalized frontline workers. My students learned a great deal, not only about the fear that people were experiencing during the pandemic, the economic hardship and the health challenges, but about resilience, about how Filipino workers came together and formed communities of care at a moment when many of them didn't qualify for COVID assistance because of their legal status. I organized this course not around my needs or research interests or the student interests, but based on what the organization needed to support and further its work. Our intention was to foster a different kind of campus community engagement. Academic engagement with surrounding communities was often extractive, where communities serve as laboratories for faculty or students, and researchers gather the information they need and then they leave. Or it is social service work, which is premised on the vulnerability and needs of the poor. We wanted to build solidarity, to engage in collective work, to cultivate relationships, and to open dialogue with people who were inside and outside the academy. So one of the guiding questions was, how can we create a model for thinking together and doing together across class, race, gender, occupational lines in a way that minimizes the hierarchy and power that often intersects in this kind of coalitional social justice work. And I bring this up because I think it reflects the intentions of the Snitow Prize, but also connects so much with the work that Sarah has done. Sarah is a prolific writer. She has far too many books for me to mention here, but she's not only a writer. She is a novelist, a teacher, an activist, a political commentator, an oral historian, a playwright, and she may even have a personal life for all we know. Although she is a distinguished professor at the College of Staten Island, for her, knowledge was never confined to academic texts. Sarah has been in the streets, has been an advocate. She writes letters and petitions. She doesn't shy away from controversy and has tackled difficult political issues. And this on-the-ground work is threaded throughout her writing. So for her, scholarship and activism are two sides of the same coin. I want to uplift in particular Sarah's work on the AIDS epidemic. In 2001, she co-founded the ACT UP Oral History Project and has conducted dozens of interviews with ACT UP members. And those interviews are publicly available and posted on a website. I encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't already done so. What I find most impressive is Sarah's reliance on oral history to tell this story, to make those voices the center of our history of AIDS and AIDS activism, and to document how that activism tangibly impacted policy as well as perception of the queer communities. So for Sarah, AIDS is not only a story of trauma and tragedy, although that certainly was there, but it is a fighting back of cultivating new forms of resistance in the context of crisis. And that certainly holds lessons for us today. And Susan Stryker said it best in her nomination letter for Sarah, and I just want to quote something from there. Susan wrote, "The web-based ACT UP Oral History Project she co-founded is an invaluable historical resource, as well as a moving tribute to the myriad people who work so hard with such love and outrage and intelligence to serve justice and save lives in the midst of a still ongoing pandemic that was tragically ignored for far too long at a time when it mattered most." Anne Snitow's feminist praxis and theorizing embraced uncertainty. For her, feminism was not a fixed ideology, but required flexibility. And we see that in Sarah's career as well. An ability to understand the moment, to consider the impact of feminist scholarship on the world around her. In so many ways, Sarah's unwavering commitment to not only theorize, but to help build a more just society in the US and abroad embodies the essence of the Anne Snitow Prize. So with that, I just want to extend a very warm congratulations to Sarah for your decades-long commitment to feminist activism and social justice, and wish you the very best for your ongoing work.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. This is quite an experience. And I'm very grateful to all of you. I see people online from my entire life, and I'm so grateful that you're all here. So I want to start thanking Ann Snitow, her legacy, her loyal friends, the inheritors of her vision. And tonight's talk is dedicated to our friend Bell Hooks, who passed away today. Do you remember the first time you ever realized you were queer or trans, or learned about this idea called feminism, or finally took in how pervasive colonialism really was in everyone's life, or suddenly grasped that although white people have all the advantages, they don't know it, or that men have all the power and use it primarily to ensure repetition of their power? And both suddenly and then gradually, a lightning bolt of insight came into your life and you realized that you live in a topsy-turvy world, that what you were being told was important and great was actually usually mediocre to awful, and that the things that were really of most value had been pushed to the side. That in fact, the entire mechanism of social life was designed to marginalize the most exciting and liberatory ideas. Do you remember the first time that happened to you? Well, luckily for me, there were many great minds that I was exposed to when I was young that helped these feelings become ideas, ideas that were tangible, and that made it possible for me to develop my own values and ways of living. One key revelation was an idea that I read in my 20s in an article by the poet Adrienne Rich. The title of her essay was Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence. And in it, she explained, as I retain the concept, that while we are constantly told that structures of power and control are neutral, natural, objective, and value-free, that the way we are positioned to live was unquestionable. In fact, these containers and constraints are not natural, neutral, objective, nor value-free, but are instead highly constructed, filled with value, and imposed by force. Another moment that was super determining in creating my worldview was reading a book by Vivian Gornick. And I have no idea how it came into my life, but the book was called The Romance of American Communism. And what I derived from it was that by asking people about their lives, we can show that ordinary people can become extraordinary through collectivity and then can become corrupt once the loyalty shifts from the shared dream of a just world to the deteriorated state of loyalty to the group itself. As is clear today in the rise of fascism and nationalism in the US and globally, there are negative bonds that unite people. And this desiccated concept of loyalty creates its own cruel mirror society, rooted in shunning and projected blame, rumor, exclusion, and the refusal to negotiate. That this is not only a practice of the powerful, but that those who were oppressed and those who are still oppressed can also be rigid, punitive, and counter to their own stated values. My takeaway lesson was that justice must be an ever-evolving idea. It is a process, not a finish line. A third intellectual pillar of my formation as a person came in the early 1980s. I had dropped out of college and came back to New York and worked as a waitress and started writing for the emerging feminist and gay newspapers that, at that time, existed in every city in the country. I enrolled in a class at Hunter College that I knew was taught by Audre Lorde. By that time, I had emerged into a lesbian community in New York City that valued poets above all, and whose largest and most dynamic social events were poetry readings. And so I was highly aware of Audre, who was very accessible, and I had seen her speak many times. The class was called US Literature after World War II, but on the first day, Audre came into the room and announced that she was changing the name of the class to The Poet as Outsider. One day she came to school and said, "Students, take out your notebooks and write this down. write this down. And on the board, she wrote a sentence that became a directive for the rest of my life. She wrote that you can't fight City Hall is a rumor being spread by City Hall. So there you have pretty much the framework that has allowed me to think, create, and understand that systems that are presented as neutral, objective, and value-free are actually constructed, filled with value, and imposed by force. That once ideals and beliefs about justice are subsumed to loyalty to group identities, these ideals are corrupted, and that the rumor that we cannot change the world is totally and utterly false. What I did not understand at the time was that adhering to these insights would put me into a constant state of both creativity and conflict for the rest of my life. Because the more creative I have become, the more conflict I have created for myself. Well, first, let me explain what I mean by creativity. Real creativity itself produces conflict. Unfortunately, the most valuable contributions that artists can make are to introduce unfamiliar approaches, undocumented experiences, and innovative ideas. Unfortunately for the artist, that is, because the corporate machine rewards repetition and confuses that with quality. When I began my life as a novelist in 1984, I was determined to create lesbian literature and to center and evolve lesbian ideas in a manner that could be stimulating and enjoyable to anyone if they were willing to identify with a lesbian protagonist. This decision meant that my contribution was actually valuable, even though I was told repeatedly that it was not, because I was learning how to convey and create absolutely new representations. However, what I did not realize was that there was a reason that these images and ideas have been so repressed and degraded and continue to be so, because they challenge the conceit of those in charge that they own objectivity. In order for them to continue to feel that they deserve their actually unfair advantages, they have to believe that they are neutral. Lesbian content had to remain labeled subjective in their evaluations for them to retain their facade of supremacy, masquerading as reality. This meant that from the start of my writing career to present, I've been ahead of the curve, sometimes literally 30 years ahead, which is no fun. What is weird is that time has shown that these works, these innovations, these experiments have often proven to eventually become legible, to in fact eventually become exciting, even entertaining. And some of my books that have had the hardest time getting published are now established. Gentrification of the Mind, my book about how the homogenization of cities changes the way people think, was rejected for publication for 10 years. My book, Conflict is Not Abuse, which I think is now in its 9th or 10th printing, was rejected by every publisher in the United States, high and low. Shout out to Arsenal Pulp Press in Vancouver, Canada. My novel, The Cosmopolitans, which I really love and believe in, a response to Balzac's Cousin Bet and Baldwin's Another Country, set in Greenwich Village in 1958, was rejected by every commercial publisher in the nation and finally presented by the Feminist press, and then went on to shock all of us when it was selected by Publishers Weekly as one of the best novels of 2016. So over and over again, I've had the same experience, that a new innovation, a new question, a new formal or genre approach, a complete discovery, all of these offerings are first seen as too ambitious or something that the editor or producer or gatekeeper doesn't find familiar and is therefore too much of a risk. And instead, what they say they want is the same book they rejected 10 years before, but is now embraced. They want what can never exist, a safe and accessible, true innovation. Now, I know that if I wrote a novel today about two women who get married and have children, I could sell it, but I don't want to. Instead, I'm writing a novel about the lesbian experience of giving each other meaning in private when there is no public meaning, and how this expresses formally and historically in the context of the larger societal question about how healing occurs. I think you already know that this has never been done before and is entirely new. And believe me, no matter how successful my book about ACT UP has been, something that sophisticated and deep about queer women is not an easy sell. Look, being a gatekeeper in a collapsing culture is a hard job, but it also involves a responsibility to be open to make the leap into the beauty of the new. We are in an excruciatingly corrupt moment in our nation's corrupt history, a time of limited range of ideas and public discourse, ideas that are often not true and cannot help. The repetition itself is a weapon of destruction. This is what Jane Jacobs called the dark age, the disappearance of both content and context. Work that opens up new conversations and ways of thinking is the risk that we all need when the stakes are so high and those conversations start at the gates. Now, there's a lot of discourse about opening up arts away from the tiny group of people who have always controlled it. There's a lot of rhetoric about creating a new American theater, one that centers the voices that have been pushed aside. And this season, more plays by Black writers and other writers of color are being produced. But open the newspapers and you will see endless canonizations of the same mediocre white men who have already been overpraised for literally decades. There are many, many talented people on this earth, but who gets opportunity is an entirely different matter, a very complex matter. Having had repeated high-end opportunity does not make one person a genius or an oracle or even good. The more outside the apparatus, the more inventive and messy you have to be about getting the space that your voice requires. That's why people and ideas that are excluded by the rules are told that they are bad for breaking the very rules and that ensure that they won't have a chance. To be effective often means to be in conflict if what you are trying to do goes against the system's own requirements. So here's a personal question. Now that I know that being ahead of the curve causes conflict, why do I keep doing it? Isn't it exhausting to always have people be mad at you for not cooperating with their structure? The truth is that I do ask systems to change, but I also ask myself to change. And I want to share that experience a little bit. The hardest emotional and intellectual self-criticism that I ever had to take on was the long process of coming to terms with Jewish supremacy ideology, the illegitimacy of racial religious domination in Israel-Palestine, and the absurdity of the way Israel positions itself as a victim when it is actually the perpetrator. I am embarrassed and ashamed that it took me so long to face these realities. And I am also ashamed that I did not come to this process through an internal determination to live according to my stated values, but instead fell into it accidentally when at the late date of 2009, I was invited by an Israeli university to give a talk and discovered that there was a Palestinian-led boycott of Israeli state-sponsored institutions. I then had to learn quickly and make decisions without full comprehension. So I know that change without being sure is both extremely difficult and absolutely possible. Today, I am a proud supporter of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement and serve as faculty advisor for Students for Justice in Palestine at my school. These changes of self-concept and positionality caused a lot of shifts in personal and institutional relationships. I was called before the CUNY Task Force on Anti-Semitism and had to refute and was eventually exonerated of absurd job and career-threatening charges of anti-Semitism. So I understand what it means to have to change when you are the person in the dominant or powerful position. And for that reason, I do not feel guilty asking others in that relationship to me to make bold, risk-taking moves that can be frightening. The times demand these processes. My primary insight into conflict itself is that it can be rooted in two different experiences, domination and trauma. That is to say that sometimes people oppose you, try to discredit you, try to punish and hurt you because your difference, your ideas, what your life force brings you to implies a change that's possibility is making them uncomfortable. And because they have believed themselves to be, as Audrey and Rich pointed out, neutral. when they are not. They interpret this discomfort, this effort to make them rethink their own position, as a terrible attack, as unjust when it is just. On the other hand, there are people who resist difference, opposition, self-criticism, because due to unresolved trauma in the past, they have such a hard time just keeping it together that the idea of questioning themselves seems impossible. That, like the failed communists of Vivian Gornick's work, they constrict into defensive escalators of false accusations, asserting their own purity to remove old or potential friends, and thereby remove the threatening ideas that are too true. For the truth of their own flaw is more than they can face. And it is true that whether the forces opposing you are united by negative bonds, determined to maintain illegitimate dominance, or simply too broken to face their own failures, actually opposing them with justice will always create difficulties. Doing the right thing will probably create conflict. Now, one of the lessons I learned by writing Let the Record Show, my history of ACT UP, is that it is very hard to get a hold of movement history. Mainstream media representations are profoundly distorted, and it takes a lot of work to actually piece together how movements triumphed and how they failed, who was in them, or what they actually believed. Even today, our most vibrant movements, the movements for abortion rights, against police violence, for Black lives, for refugee and immigration rights, for Palestinian liberation, and for economic justice, all of these movements are very vague in public representation. The fact that there are specific leaders in every city in the country with precise demands, that there are concrete organizations working for real change, the details of all these efforts is made elusive by corporate representation, but they are there. So on all fronts, artistically, politically, in our personal interactions with institutions and our relationships, our organizational affiliations, this is the moment to offer direct alternatives, to give the individuals with whom we interact the opportunity to take the chance towards equity, justice, experimentation, towards expansion in a retracting world. Clearly, we have to create discomfort constantly, because that you can't fight City Hall is only a rumor, and that rumor is being spread by City Hall. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sarah. That was really great. And you've begun to talk a lot about conflict, which is, of course, the subject of the upcoming conversation with Susan Stryker. I first thought about, thank you, first of all, Susan, for nominating Sarah. We're so lucky. Oops, didn't start my video. Here I am. Thanks to Susan for nominating Sarah. A few years ago at the 40th anniversary celebration of Jonathan Ned Katz's Gay American History, Susan gave a wonderful keynote in which she talked about the exclusions of trans people by what was then called the gay liberation movement in the late 60s and early 70s. She used Melanie Klein, the psychoanalyst's concept of, of reparations, which is bringing together the parts of a damaged and divided self to repair that damage, and then to move forward, to become whole, to become more healthy. And she applied that to our movements, to feminism, to queer liberation, to trans, a way to remake history by pulling all of these conflictual parts together. As Sarah has said, conflict is a big part of working in movements, of moving forward, of being at the front edge. And her book, as she said, Conflict is Not Abuse, has become sort of a cult classic already within restorative justice circles where I travel. Susan Stryker, I want to just introduce briefly, as the Barbara Lee Distinguished Chair in Women's Leadership at Mills College till 2022. She is the pioneer, leading trans feminist activist and theorist, a founding co-editor of the journal TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly, and author of Transgender History, The Roots of Today's Revolution. She's a co-director of the Emmy-winning documentary film Screaming Queens, The Riot at Compton's Cafeteria. And so I open this conversation to the two of you to talk about love/hurts, conflict, compassion, and feminist community building. Thanks to you both.
Thank you, Judith. I'll just say it's been an honor for me to serve on the Ann Snitow Prize nominating committee. You know, when I was thinking about the spirit, you know, that Anne sort of embodied, you know, as Judith was talking about earlier, of thinking of feminism as something that could be sometimes contentious, and, you know, that it was like an argument you wanted to have. I thought, you know, who do I want to nominate? You know, and I thought, you know, Sarah Schulman, because, you know, I agree with Sarah about 90% of the time. And if I disagree with her about something, it's like, I can't think of anybody I'd rather disagree with, because it's like, there's a good process there, you know, and it's everything that Sarah said in her talk about like that willingness to both like put out your opinion, but to actually listen and to be willing to engage in self-transformation, even as you're trying to hold other people accountable. And I just thought, what could be a better, you know, who could be a better person to nominate for this prize? And you know, I was tickled, probably not as tickled as Sarah was when the committee selected her. I thought, right on, it's like they're doing the right thing here. So so yeah, I mean, Sarah, I just wanted to say congratulations, and it was an honor to nominate you.
Thank you for the support, Susan.
And you know, we got a lot of things that we can talk about on the theme of love, hurts, compassion, feminist community building. But one of the places that I wanted to start, and maybe we'll move from here, but I wanted to start about talking about Roe v. Wade. You know, that the you know, as we all know, it is hanging by a thread and on life support right now. And I can't think of a more pressing feminist issue to be mobilizing around right now. And then my historian brain kicks in and I think, yeah, 1973, like Roe v. Wade, it's like that was where a certain kind of feminist victory was won. And that was exactly the same year that a lot of trans people who had been involved in some of the more radical phase of sexuality, gender liberation politics in the late 60s and early 70s kind of get very explicitly like read out of the movement. You know, 73 was a pivotal year. And it's always struck me, you know, that sort of the mantra of like my body, my right to decide, it was it applied to some feminist women and not to some other feminist women. So like that question about bodily autonomy and who gets to have bodily autonomy is like, I think one of the terrains, the territories that feminist struggles can be waged on. You know, like it's a place that there's been disagreement within feminism about who gets to have autonomy, who gets to have rights, who gets to have freedoms. But anyway, I bring all of that up because it's sort of on the theme of what we'll be talking about. But I also know that you're doing some work right now on Roe, and I was hoping that maybe you could tell me a little bit more about what you're doing, and as well as tell the audience. It's like you have a play.
Yeah, but I mean, let's go back to the real Roe v. Wade. You know, it's been a long history. I was in high school when abortion became legal in New York City in 1971. And then the Supreme Court case is 73. And then from 73 to 79 is really the only time in this country that we actually had accessible abortion rights, because 79 is the Hyde Amendment. And after that, there were only 7 states that would pay Medicaid funding for abortion. In 79, I joined an organization right after Hyde called Carassa, and I see Tina Grossman is on the in the audience here, who was in Carassa with me, and Ann Snitow was also in the reproductive rights movement. And this was the committee for abortion rights and against sterilization abuse. And that was the radical reproductive rights movement. There also was a single issue abortion rights movement. And that was represented by groups that evolved later, like NARAL and the NOW's Abortion Rights Committee. And then there was International Planned Parenthood, which is very different than the Planned Parenthood we know today. International Planned Parenthood was the population control, sterilization, kind of rooted in the old eugenics wing. So there was a very broad right spectrum of feminists or of people involved in this movement. And I'm just interested, since we had talked a little bit before the show about feminist anti-trans politics and where it is the most virulent and where it's powerful. And so where on that spectrum do you think anti-trans politics was expressed in when you said 73? So that's actually quite early. Yeah. Before
yeah, well, so it's in 73 that, I mean, like when I look at the history of what now gets called, anti-trans feminism or TERFism or gender critical feminism or whatever, word you want to use for it, I see it, the beginnings of it, the glimmers of it, like 69 to 71. But it's really then in 73 that it really kind of bursts into the mainstream, so to speak, where you've got, Sylvia Rivera getting, kind of booed off the stage at in New York at the Christopher Street Liberation Day event, or Beth Elliott getting kind of hounded out of the lesbian conference at UCLA. And it was in that moment that you had this new idea about trans women aren't women, trans women are infiltrators in women's space, trans women are rapists, trans women violate women, et cetera, et cetera. It's like that whole shtick didn't really exist in the 60s. It's something that really crystallized around 1973, and you start to see gay and lesbian groups taking up that position of like, oh, trans people aren't part of what's going on here. They're trying to access medical care to, reproduce negative gender stereotypes. And it's at the exact same, it's in the same year that you see a really significant success of arguments about, to be really broad brushstrokes, my body, my right to decide. But what trans politics teaches in relationship to that is my body, my right to decide if you're the right body making certain decisions about certain things, and that same rhetoric or slogan or ethos did not apply to trans people. So I'm not saying that anybody in the abortion rights or reproductive freedom movement was being explicitly transphobic, kind of like at a 35,000 foot flyover level. There were certain arguments being made about, in the name of a feminist politics, about bodily autonomy that some people, and some people who thought of themselves as women, were being excluded from by other mechanisms of power. And so, I think there's been a way that some feminisms have been predicated on certain notions of biologism, while, other forms of feminism have rejected biologism as a basis of feminist politics. Like I think about the Combahee River Collective statement, that basically, where they're saying, we don't believe in a kind of female separatism because, we as Black women, we can't reduce our oppression to biology, reproductive biology, and the same, So yeah, I mean, some of our conversation was about how there's many kinds of feminism. It's like, I think there's some kinds of feminism I totally support and am behind, and then there are other kinds of feminism that have been harnessed to very pernicious ends. You mentioned like eugenic arguments, or there'd be like, ethno-nationalist versions of feminism. There can be like, white liberal Eurocentric versions of feminism that perpetrate colonialism.
Also,
so anyway, yeah.
Okay, I mean, getting back to abortion, and it fits into what you're talking about, there's an incredible co-optation of feminist tropes, feminist language, and feminist discoveries by the right wing. The other day, I was looking at reporting that I did for Woman News, which was the feminist newspaper of New York City, founded in 1979. And in 1982, I covered an anti-abortion conference that took place. I went and I remember I wore a dress and a cross around my neck. So I went in kind of underground. And in my reporting in 1982, I was like, these people are using our ideas. Like they were just starting to say like, well, you should do speak outs of women who regret that they had abortion. So they were taking the tactic of women speaking out and then co-opting it. And, today when we listen to this nightmare that's going on in the Supreme Court, their arguments are pseudo-feminist arguments that they're using to justify controlling women and forcing them into motherhood or into trauma or however, taking away women's autonomy. Now, I don't know, I wouldn't call that feminism. I'm old-fashioned, right? So I think that feminism is a concept or a movement that is for all women to have self-determination. And if you're using feminist language, but you're not for all women to have self-determination, I don't consider it to be feminism. But anyway, I do know, for example, I understand that in England, there's so much vile, pathological anti-trans stuff going on, and that it's in all the tabloids and it's very mainstream. And that some of the people involved in that are people who did in the past fight for like abortion rights and things like that. But in the United States, I don't have the sense. I feel like feminists are so out of power here that I don't have the sense. I mean, I know there are small groups of people for whom that is a position, but I don't see them as having influence. Do you?
It's a difficult question because, what I can say is like, I see down in the trenches of trying to do feminist work in gender studies departments or in the academy or in communities where I live that I am sometimes quite shocked at, what it's like, oh, I thought that you were like on my side about something, that it's like, oh, it's like I thought we were allies, and then like boom, you get hit in the face with somebody's either overt or implicit transphobia. I mean, it's really there, and it's not necessarily on the surface. And so, yeah, I do think there is a lot of unspoken transphobia in feminism that it's like if it doesn't get pointed at you, you don't see it. It's like the same way like white people don't see things because it doesn't get pointed at them. So yeah, I do think it's there. Does that mean that? Yeah, I mean, I don't know if what more I want to say about that other than that, like I do, experience transphobia within feminist circles. And that's part of what leads me to say like, well, like there's lots of different kinds of feminism. There's like feminism gets used to advance all kinds of interests, like, white suffragists who are saying like it's a shame that like white women can't vote and black men can. It's just like that's not a feminism that I would want to stand behind, or a kind of like, rescue feminism of imagining that, all women are victims and I'm going to be the, white knight in shining armor who's going to, come in and, rescue these, poor people in other countries who are being mistreated. That's not a kind of feminism that I would want to stand behind. And
Right.
so for me, the trans question in feminism is, for me, it's like it's almost like getting back to kind of like a 70s idea of like political lesbianism in an odd way. It's like, well, what's a woman? Is that like a biologically based category, or is it a category where people share certain kinds of social oppression? Is it a political alignment, and alliance, or is it biologically based? And there's this feminist conversation about it. It's like, there are many versions of feminism that say we can't reduce this to biology. And so yeah, there are people who call themselves feminists who are recognized as feminists by other people who, in the name of a feminist politics, will do and say anti-trans things. So there's a fight within feminism over these kinds of questions. And I don't want to spend all of our time talking about trans issues. It's like it's not the only thing to talk about, but I think it does become a great example of how there can be conflict about something, but it doesn't have to be experienced as abuse, by anybody who's involved in it.
I think it is clear that women are doing incredibly badly right now. Inclusively defined, women are really doing badly. And it is amazing to, something that I never would have predicted would be that women would lose every time we go before the courts and that gay people would win. And that gay men have made so much incredible progress. Obviously, class and race are sorting factors in that statement, and that women are so far from power. And that is not the trajectory that I anticipated when I was 16 years old in New York City and abortion was becoming legal. And it's remarkable. And one of the things that I really thought about a lot when I started to get involved with Palestine Solidarity is how hard it is to understand ourselves as people who have experienced profound oppression and then in a short period of time become oppressors. And I look at the difference between Jews in 1945, and then you go to 1948, where suddenly there's not suddenly, but there's a nation state where an entire other people are being suppressed. And what do you do with this transformation? Or gay men in the early 80s who were profoundly oppressed, whose lives had no meaning, and who were facing a terminal disease for which there were no treatments. And then today, white gay men is a privileged category in many parts of this country. So this thing about how we have to be so aware that trauma from the past that definitely determines who we are today may not be our reality today, and how to integrate that. Even a trans woman or a Black woman who are walking down the street and are subjected to humiliations, threats, violence, can walk into the place that they're going and be a person who has responsibility, who has power, who has the ability to damage somebody else's life. That these things can change in the course of minutes or hours. And so to be self-aware about the fluctuations of power, that's one of the hardest things to do. And so to now see the transformation of gay white male life, because I guess primarily because of men's economic earning power and because of marketing, I think that the marketing and assimilation has made that entity so much more powerful than I think I ever understood. And women who don't have economic power, and of course that's mitigated by class and race, as Belle was always reminding us. I'm seeing that people are making comments in the chat.
That's exactly what I was gonna jump to, because some of the questions that are coming in are sort of exactly the questions I wanted to start asking about trauma. That if our conversation was called Love Hurts, conflict, compassion, and feminist community building, it's like that idea of what's the hurt that sort of needs to be repaired is a question. And I think a lot of the divisions within feminist communities, within queer communities, is when people say, we don't share the same wound, just like I've been hurt in a certain way and my politics are mobilizing around the repair of a particular hurt, and you don't share my hurt, so you're not part of my community. And that the questions that are coming in, I'm not going to name names unless people say they want their names called out, but we have a couple of questions here, comments here. Past trauma makes us vulnerable to misusing power ourselves. Trauma does not teach us to be empathic. And then
let me respond to that. Okay, that comes from Catherine Hodes, is the person who's really influenced me, because she is the person who came up with the the difference between conflict and abuse, that definition that I use in my book, that conflict is power struggle and abuse is power over. And she's the originator of that concept. And I totally agree with her. Trauma does not make us better. You know, there is this Christian idea, I think it's based on Christ on the cross, that suffering makes you better. But that's not my experience of life. Sometimes suffering makes us worse. So yes, that is, thank you, Catherine, for that.
And then the follow-up question, how can people let go of trauma as part of continuing identity?
I don't know if the goal is to let go of it. Because I'm not one of those people who believes on moving on. That's not my goal. But it's to, I think that if the communities that surround us, our friends, our cliques, our families, if you're in that structure, if your community sees their responsibility to help you negotiate with other people, then they can help us not use unresolved past pain to punish people in the present who did not cause that pain. And that is the challenge. You know, you don't want to deny that experience or repress it, but it's the projection of blame that we need other people to intervene to help us avoid.
I'm trying to read the
This is
comments
Ann
here.
Snitow saying feminism can't maintain a fixed stance and it's always struggle for always shifting affiliations and aesthetics. Yes, thank you, Ann. That's the old, that's the old permanent revolution approach to feminism, which I share.
Yeah, a good perspective to keep in mind. And I just say I see Sharon Thompson has a comment that I was talking about currents that like of feminist transphobia that do exist in some settings virulently, but do not recall them coming up in Carassa or an abortion rights discussion in '73. And I just want to be clear that I wasn't trying to suggest in any way that conversation was happening in those places, that when I look back on 1973 and see what happened that year, it's just like, on the one hand, you had homosexuality being depathologized. You know, that's when it fell out of the DSM because of activism to get homosexuality depathologized. And that is the year that the Roe v. Wade victory happened at the Supreme Court. And it's the year that that transsexualism starts to become officially pathologized. And it's the year that trans people who had been involved in movement cultures for sexual and gender liberation started to confront a new kind of discourse about them that previously hadn't existed. So I'm just struck by the historical irony of this moment where some people are saying, my body, my right to decide. At the same time, other people are being denied that opportunity. So it wasn't about speaking about a particular movement. I wasn't trying to say that the reproductive choice movement was being transphobic. I was commenting on, a broader historical.
Well, I mean, there's so many metaphors that are running wild right now. I mean, the anti-vaxxers are wearing Jewish, yellow stars, and it's kind of like
or saying my body, my right to decide, like using that slogan to say I don't have to get a vaccine. It's like it's interesting to me the way, the slogans circulate in such widely different contexts, how they can mean really different things to really different people at really different times.
Well, I mean, I think we have to face that, our population is extremely underinformed. I mean, people, who didn't know that their health care was the same thing as Obamacare. Even in where I teach at the College of Staten Island, a lot of my students don't realize that they go to a public university and they don't know that there are private universities. Like, our American people are very uninformed about the facts of the structures in which they are functioning. And so there's so much symbolic thinking that's extremely distorted. Okay, now, somebody asked, what is the role of trans men in feminism? Well, it's the same as any men. I've often thought that one of the reasons that the abortion rights movement fell apart, if we agree that that's what happened, is that straight men kind of never got involved in it. And, movements have to be places that make it the lives better of the people who are in the movements, right? So if you're asked to be in a movement in which you're not going to find love and sex, that's not a movement that is sustainable. And the abortion rights movement needed to be a co-gender movement. So that seems to be like one of the big challenges, is to get men involved in reproductive rights.
And I'm going to sidestep the men or trans men and feminist movements question right now, partly because I don't feel like I can personally speak to that, although maybe we'll circle back around to it later, or maybe some trans guys in the chat might put some comments in that we can share with everyone. But in the interest of time, since I think we've got about 25 minutes left, I know that we were talking earlier about you writing a play about
yes,
Roe, and it's just like we are here to honor you tonight, and so tell us about how this.
Yes, so I have
I
have a play about the Roe v. Wade case that I think is very surprising, highly theatrical, and it is not about what you think it's about. It's the untold story, which is quite a complicated story. And lucky for me, Hartford Stage, the regional theater that's run by Melia Ben Susan, wants to do the world premiere of this play, to be directed by Lisa Peterson, who's a very well-known and respected director. But they need a co-pro from another theater. And we need to find another regional theater that's not afraid of a play about the true complexities about the coalitions that created the Roe v. Wade case. And theaters that are in red states are fearful of taking this on. So I want to ask anyone out there who is a subscriber to a regional theater or who is friends with someone who works at a regional theater, if you will message me on Facebook or at my account at the College of Staten Island, I'll send you a script. And if you can send that to them or to any independent producer who you know, we're almost there. And I so want to cross that line because, there's no common cultural work about women's lives that the whole culture has seen. There's no like female angels in America, or the way like Roots was something that everyone saw and became a central point of discussion. The history of abortion is something that people only piece together based on how old they are and what eclectic influences they have. And this, I think I've made something that could do this work, and it's epic, but I need help from the community in moving it forward. So please, if you have extra money and you've always wanted to be a theater producer, or you know people who are theater producers, please contact me. So thank you, Susan, for that.
You're welcome. Do we get a little sneak preview of the work, or
here because
can we say you heard it here first? No.
Well, I'm not a good actress because unfortunately I can only be myself. But there are some wonderful actors who are involved with this. So thank you for asking that.
Good. And I'll just say to the audience, if you have questions that you would like to pose or some comments that I'll read here, but if you have questions for the last 10 to 15 minutes of time that we have, we'd be really happy to hear from you. We've both been talking a lot. So one of the comments in the chat from Jude Johnston, Sarah, I feel like there were attempts at working with hierarchy and orgs with some feminisms, and there is increased hierarchy these days and professionalism of feminisms, health, politics, others. So organizationally, it must be more difficult to work collectively, even in the arts.
I don't find that, because I think that that's the only way that change actually gets made. This is one of the obstacles that I faced in writing A History of ACT UP, is that there was a previous kind of false historicization that said, oh, this incredible paradigm shift was accomplished by 5 heroic white individuals. And, this is the John Wayne structure of American myth, right? That there's this white individual who's going to heroically come and save the day. And of course, they never do. And not only is that inaccurate in ACT UP, it's inaccurate in any kind of paradigm shift. It's not only inaccurate, it's impossible. Because in this country, change gets made by coalition, and this was, so collectivity is the only way to go. And that's why we can't demand that people agree with each other about everything. That's why we need shifting relationships and shifting alliances so that we can work with people we agree with on this thing and then work with these people that we agree with on that thing. And that's what radical democracy is. And that's what Big Tent politics is. And Vivian Gornick's book on the romance of American communism is the perfect example of why that structure failed. When you try to have disciplined movements where everyone is supposed to have the same opinion, it just doesn't work. It's never worked historically. So collectivity is the only way to go. And I say this as a novelist, which is a very solitary endeavor. But if you in order to make space for a singular voice, you have to work with other people to create the possibility of singularity. Because without that, without the collective agreement that there should be singular voice, there will not be.
All right, so to take a couple of questions, there's 3 here. So one, Sarah, Jessica Glennon-Zukov asks, what were your thoughts on Lisa Loomer's 2016 Roe play?
Right, it's an entirely different, that's an entirely different endeavor. It has almost nothing to do with what I'm doing.
Okay, quick answer. Catherine Hodes asks, Nikki Parezzo at La Mama.
Okay, so don't just start suggesting people. I have, if you personally out there have a relationship with someone that you can talk to about the play, please let me know and I will work with you. But we're looking for a real regional theater. Hartford Stage is a very well-respected, high-level regional theater. And we're looking for another theater like that with producing abilities to co-pro with them.
Okay, so to move on to other questions on other topics, from Dana Tortorici. Sarah, do you think the internet poses new challenges for collective organizing? People can come together in bigger numbers than ever before, but the marches can dissolve just as fast.
Well, I think ultimately that the most creative solutions are found when people have experiences with each other over some kind of time and start to understand the complexities of each other's lives, and in that way come together to create solutions. And that's very hard to do without affect. And so, of course, there's a million things that the internet can do, but there's also a lot of things that they can't do. And I think the key problem in your question is the word marches, because marches is not necessarily a constructive tactic. What I learned from studying ACT UP, and the reason I think ACT UP is a good model to look at, is because they had enormous victories. In the 6 years that I cover in my book from 87 to 93, they forced the FDA to have a fast track for experimental drugs. They got needle exchange made legal in New York. They made it so that women with HIV could get into experimental trials and get benefits. They had really concrete victories that saved many people's lives, millions of people's lives across the world. And when you look at how they did it, you see that they wouldn't just get all these people together and make them go to Washington and stand in the cold and listen to somebody give a speech. That was not the way they did things. They built campaigns. So first, ACT UP would become the expert on the issue. They would devise the solution that was reasonable, winnable, and doable, instead of being in an infantilized relationship to power, where you're asking the powers that be to solve the problem. They will never solve the problem, okay? So ACT UP would create the solution, and then they would present the solution to the powers that be. And when they refused it, they would then do what Martin Luther King called self-purification, or ACT UP called nonviolent civil disobedience training, and would do theatrical and nonviolent civil disobedience that would telegraph through the media to the public what their reasonable solution was. And in this way, put pressure on institutions. And that's called building a campaign. And some kind of public action can be part of that campaign. But unless you have concrete demands that you're working towards, you often are just wasting people's energy by asking them to come out to a march in which they're asked to be passive. And you need a very empowered constituency in order to be able to take this campaign approach. And what's interesting, I interviewed 188 surviving members of ACT UP over 18 years. And those interviews are available at actuporalhistory.org. And, they're very fascinating people. They're quite individual, but they're all quite sophisticated about their issues because the institution had all of these teach-ins and there were no designated spokespeople. Anybody in ACT UP could be the spokesperson. So people had to be really up to snuff on their subject matter, and they were. And that's what enabled this kind of empowering participation. So marches should be used judiciously.
I'm gonna quote Katie Detweiler here, who just brings up Anne Snitow again, saying Anne was always engaged with the speculative against the narrowing of desires, even as people have to work on specific and concrete projects. Any comment on the speculative future against the narrowing of desire produced by apocalyptic narratives?
I don't understand what that means. Can you come back, Katie?
We'll come back. So Katie, stick that back in there. And there is a follow-up on the internet query from Rachel Fagan. Thanks for this conversation. To add to the internet query, given ways social media are created to make us addicted and to manipulate our emotions, and that these algorithms are often produced by cishet male coders who shape and limit our interactions, how would you recommend that we get people offline to both inform them and allow them to organize? What are you seeing that works, or what could work?
I don't have an answer to that, and I'm not sure I totally feel that way, but I do think the best thing is for people to sit down and face each other and talk about things. I've always felt that, and I still feel that. I do want to talk to Atina Grossman here, who wrote a book that really influenced me, which was about the role of women in Weimar Germany. And I read it like 30 years ago, but I remember thinking about it quite a bit. So thank you for that, Atina. And she talked about teaching. I dropped out of the University of Chicago, and it was a place that I could not function. And I went to Hunter College, and Audre Lorde was my teacher. And that was my first A that I ever got in my whole college career. And I learned a lot from her about teaching and how to teach with very large classes, which we have at the College of Staten Island. And one of the key things that she did was that by the second day of class, she knew everybody's name. And people in the class would say things like, I have been in this school for 4 years and no one has ever known my name until I took this class. So that's how I start. And then I really use this thing. On the first day of school, I always write the word individuation on the blackboard. And I tell the students that that is my teaching method. And that means that my responsibility is to find out who you are as an individual and where you are starting from so that I can see your progress, and I'm going to grade you based on your progress, which of course gives me a total out to give them any grade I wish. But it means that you then have to do what Audre also did, which is individuate each student as you're standing in the middle of the circle. I put them in a circle so they can't text in the back row. And just like you're constantly catching people's eye and saying, remember, like in your paper last week, you said blah, blah, or just as you said last week, da-da. And it's like grabbing them and saying, I'm listening to you. And I remember what you said in your paper, and I'm actually paying attention. One of the things, and I see my colleague, Matt Brim, online, one of the things that happens at a school when your students are undocumented or poor, or they're going to school on Friday night and their kid is sitting on their lap on Zoom, which is something that I have, is that they don't think that you notice them. And my students are always saying, like, dear professor, I'm so-and-so in your Tuesday night class. And I'm like, I know who you are. It's just this kind of making the connection so that people know that you're real. And, at the College of Staten Island, very few of my students are going to be writers. I probably sent like 10 writers to MFA programs in 23 years. And what I found is that they don't do well in those programs. They don't make friends. The teachers don't mentor them because they're coming from a class background where they don't have the same frames of reference, no matter how talented they are. And so they don't get the same goodies. And I stay in relationship to these students. Some of them I've been with for 15 or 20 years since they graduated. And they tell me that, they're still writing, but they now have 4 kids and they have to go write in their car. Or this kind of thing. It's just a completely different track. It's not about building careers. It's about just trying to connect on a very deep human way. So thanks for the question, Atina.
So we got the sort of note that we should be wrapping up here really soon, but Katie Detweiler did post again. Maybe that question was a bit broad. The idea was just to call in, excuse me, call in Anne's genius and spirit that all organizing contains a kernel of utopia, of future. So how small acts of organizing contain utopic futures? I guess I thought you could speak to that from the historical perspective you've cultivated about ACT UP and maybe reinstall that for this moment regarding reproductive rights and trans rights.
Well, that's why I said that justice is a process and not the finish line, because we have to constantly be in a state of change, and it's frustrating and it means taking risks, but we're losing and we've lost a lot of ground, and it's an apocalyptic moment now. So this is not the time, I'm a post-Holocaust person. I was born in 1958, and I knew about the Holocaust since the second I stepped out of my mother's womb. And one of the things my parents talked about endlessly was how the socialists and the communists were fighting against each other and the Nazis came to power. And I know that that's simplistic, but it's also accurate. And this is not the time for purity. And this is not the time for insisting that the people you work with agree with everything that you agree with. It is not going to work. And it's not activism to just take down other people. Activism means creating new communities, creating new solutions, working out the kinks of those solutions, communicating them to other people. We have with such communication problem about what we believe and concretely what we want. And let's stay on that track.
Amen. To stand on that track. I'm kind of vamping till somebody on the organizing committee says you want to have some final remarks. So Miriam, you're here. Okay, so if you'd like to close us out, Sarah, thanks so much for having a conversation with me, and it's been an honor to be here with you tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We are just waiting for Laura to come on with me. There she is. Okay.
Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Liu, co-chair of the nominating committee, and together with my colleague and friend Miriam Tickton, we're just going to say a few things here at the closing. Thank you, Sarah and Susan, for such an utterly feminist exchange in a way that truly Anne would have loved to have heard and been part of.
This is a wonderful example of what bell hooks would have called unpacking imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, cis hetero patriarchy. Bell hooks spoke of revolutionary love and love as a practice of freedom. And this discussion has aptly complicated the meaning of love and the practice of freedom. Who gets to do it? There is no room for purity, as Sarah said.
So we would like to close with deep gratitude to the feminist community that has enabled the Anne Snitow Prize to come together and to continue to support work like Premila's and Sarah's that continues a 10-year vision in Anne's honor. This work depends upon the labor and collective care of so many.
So on behalf of the nominating committee, many of whom are here, we want to extend our deepest thanks for the work you've all done to spread the word through your networks and for nominating worthy feminist candidates yourselves.
And on behalf of the organizing committee, we want to again extend the deepest thanks to this year's jury for the labor required to consider so many outstanding nominations in order to arrive at the selection of Sarah this year.
So this is the second year of a prize that's planned to last for another 8 more cycles. So we would like to close by encouraging everyone here to nominate someone incredible next year and in the years to come. We clearly need to encourage and honor this kind of incredibly important work. So please keep an eye out for the call for nominations for 2022.
With that, thank you to everyone who has attended to hear these wonderful remarks from Judith, Premila, and Sarah, and the incredibly thought-provoking conversation between Sarah and Susan. In memory of Bell Hooks, who touched and inspired so many of us, and in honor, as always, of Ann Snitow, thank you for coming, for supporting this prize, and for celebrating Sarah Schulman, this year's worthy recipient.
Thank you so much. Have a good night, everybody.